In the summer of 1914, deep within the rugged landscapes of Sicily, a chilling story began to spread through isolated farming villages. It was the kind of tale whispered in hushed tones, behind shuttered windows and locked doors, as though speaking it too loudly might summon something dreadful. The story was of a family that did the unthinkable, turning on its own blood, consuming flesh in acts that blurred the line between survival and monstrosity. In a land already haunted by famine, superstition, and secrecy, the rumors took on a life of their own. Whether born from truth, distorted through fear, or crafted as a form of scapegoating, the legend of the family that ate its own carved itself into the collective memory of Sicilian history. To understand why such a story could grip an entire region, one must step back into the harsh realities of early 20th century Sicily. This was a time before Italy had fully modernized, before the southern villages were truly connected to the industrial north. In the rural heartlands, life moved slowly, bound to the rhythm of agriculture, religion, and survival. Families worked the soil with their bare hands, and when crops failed, hunger was not a distant possibility, it was a certainty. In such conditions, desperate acts were whispered about in every generation. But what set this family apart was the horrifying suggestion that their desperation had turned inward. The tale was not told in the streets of bustling Palermo or in the academic halls of Rome. Instead, it belonged to the stone houses perched on hillsides, to farmers who relied as much on oral tradition as they did on their fields. These were communities that carried centuries of superstition, where faith in the Catholic Church coexisted with ancient folk beliefs, and where anything strange, unusual, or outside the boundaries of normal life was quickly branded as cursed, damned, or inhuman. It was here, in this mixture of faith and fear, that the rumor of cannibalism found fertile ground. But this was no ordinary accusation. To consume human flesh was to commit the most profound violation of both moral and spiritual law. Even in times of war or famine, when tales of cannibalism occasionally surfaced, they were always spoken of with revulsion, with the belief that such acts left a permanent stain on those involved. In Sicily, where family honor was everything, to be branded as the family that ate its own meant carrying a burden that stretched far beyond the events of a single year. It meant condemnation for generations, with descendants forever shadowed by the sins of their ancestors, whether those sins were real or imagined. The story of 1914 presents itself as more than a grotesque anecdote. It is a mystery rooted in multiple possibilities. Was this truly an instance of cannibalism, driven by starvation and isolation? Or was it the result of genetic illness, strange behaviors misinterpreted by fearful neighbors? Or perhaps it was never real at all, merely the invention of gossip, magnified by the paranoia of small villages and the human tendency to demonize those who do not fit the mold of normalcy. Each theory provides a different lens through which to examine the case, and each reflects a different side of human nature, our capacity for survival, our fear of the abnormal, and our willingness to condemn. To draw the viewer in, it is necessary to consider how fragile the line between folklore and fact can be. Stories of cannibalism in history often serve as morality tales, warnings to future generations of what happens when desperation overcomes humanity. Yet, in other cases, they are tools of exclusion, branding a group as outsiders to keep them at the margins of society. In Sicily, where villages were bound by strong social codes, to be marked as outsiders was to be condemned to an existence of suspicion and shame. For this family, the tale of cannibalism may have been both, a genuine response to hardship and a weapon of social ostracism wielded by those around them. The year 1914 also holds its own significance. Across Europe, the drums of war were beginning to sound. While Sicily was geographically removed from the immediate chaos of World War I, the tensions of the time shaped daily life. Resources were tighter, men were leaving for the front, and communities were left fractured and vulnerable. In such instability, strange events could quickly spiral into legend. The case of this family becomes not just a story of survival or illness, but a reflection of how uncertainty magnifies fear. As we open this investigation, it is crucial to understand that the truth may never be fully known. The documents are sparse, the testimonies contradictory, and the folklore heavily embroidered with time. But that is precisely what gives the story its haunting power. It exists in the liminal space between history and legend, between fact and superstition. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What are humans truly capable of when pushed to the brink? Can hunger, illness, or isolation strip away the deepest taboos of our species? And more disturbingly, how much of this tale is about what they did, and how much is about what we wanted to believe they did? The story of the family that ate its own is not one of gore for shock's sake. It is a window into human psychology, into cultural fear, and into the fragile boundaries that separate civilization from barbarism. It challenges us to consider how much of our moral compass is fixed, and how much is subject to change when life itself hangs in the balance. As we journey deeper into Sicily's hills, into the whispered testimonies and forgotten archives, the question lingers like a shadow. Was this family monstrous by nature, by necessity, or by the weight of rumor alone? And so, the stage is set. A land gripped by poverty, a family shrouded in secrecy, and a legend that refuses to die. This is the beginning of a story that is as much about the dark corners of the human mind as it is about history itself. The case of 1914 forces us into a confrontation with humanity's deepest taboos, and with the unsettling possibility that the line between victim and monster is not always as clear as we would like it to be. To truly grasp why the legend of the family that ate its own could take root, one must first walk through the Sicily of 1914. This was not the Sicily of sunlit postcards and picturesque vineyards. It was a land divided between beauty and brutality, where fertile soil could not always guarantee survival, and where the shadow of hunger lingered over every family. In the early 20th century, Sicily stood at the crossroads of tradition and modernity, yet in its rural heartlands, life remained almost medieval in its harshness. The industrial north of Italy was pulling forward, but the south, especially the island villages, remained shackled to poverty, superstition, and a grinding cycle of scarcity. Sicilian peasants lived on the margins of survival. The average family toiled as tenant farmers under the latifundia system, where vast estates were owned by absentee landlords and worked by the poor. Harvests were unpredictable, wages meager, and food insecurity a constant reality. Bread, olives, beans, and the occasional meat formed the foundation of their diet, but a single failed harvest or blight could devastate entire villages. In such conditions, famine was not a distant historical memory but a recurring fear that lived in every household. Malnutrition was common, and disease spread easily through weakened bodies. It was in this fragile world that whispers of desperate acts began to circulate. Beyond hunger, there was also isolation. Many Sicilian villages were perched high in the mountains, separated by miles of rocky terrain. Travel was difficult, and communities were often cut off from one another, especially during harsh winters. In these closed environments, families became insular, traditions rigid, and suspicions sharp. Outsiders were viewed with caution, and those who behaved strangely, or who carried physical or mental illnesses, were quickly labeled as cursed or dangerous. A family marked by unusual habits could become the subject of relentless gossip, their every misstep magnified into evidence of corruption or sin. In a place where honor and reputation were everything, such whispers could destroy lives. Layered on top of this material struggle was the immense weight of religion and superstition. Sicily in 1914 was fiercely Catholic, but faith was often entwined with older folk traditions and beliefs in curses, omens, and the evil eye. Priests held immense influence, but so did local healers and midwives, who offered charms and remedies that were half medicine, half magic. Misfortune rarely came without explanation. If crops failed, if livestock died, if a child sickened, someone was to blame. A family living on the fringes, already regarded with suspicion, could quickly be cast as the source of evil in the village. And what accusation could be more damning than cannibalism, the ultimate betrayal of both human decency and divine law? The timing of 1914 only deepened these tensions. Across Europe, the First World War was beginning to erupt, reshaping economies and drawing men into armies. Sicily, though geographically distant from the front lines, was not untouched. Many young men were conscripted, leaving villages with fewer laborists to tend the land. Food shortages became more pronounced, and with money and resources funneled toward the war effort, already fragile communities felt the strain. Families left behind were more vulnerable than ever, their survival dependent on meager harvests and the goodwill, or hostility, of neighbors. In such uncertainty, rumors thrived like weeds in neglected soil. Sicily also carried a long history of emigration. Entire families had left for America in search of a better life, leaving behind fractured communities where those who stayed were often the poorest, the least mobile, and sometimes the most marginalized. Villages emptied of strong sons and daughters could feel ghostly, and those who remained behind often clung to old traditions even more tightly. Against this backdrop, a family that seemed different, whether by behavior, appearance, or misfortune, could quickly become the focus of fear. The concept of otherness was deeply entrenched in Sicilian society. Families who intermarried too closely, who suffered from visible illnesses, or who bore the stain of past disgrace were often whispered about. Isolation breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds stories. If a child went missing, if bones were found in a field, if screams were heard in the night, the imagination of the community filled in the blanks. And once the seed of cannibalism was planted, it was nearly impossible to uproot. It is important to understand that accusations of cannibalism have historically been used not only to describe real acts of desperation but also as tools of demonization. Throughout history, marginalized groups have often been accused of such practices, sometimes to justify their persecution, sometimes simply as a way to explain the inexplicable. In famine-ridden or deeply religious communities, these accusations carried more than social stigma, they carried eternal damnation. To be seen as consuming flesh was not only a crime against man but a sin against God, placing an entire family outside the realm of salvation. In 1914 Sicily, where faith was everything, such an accusation was worse than death. And yet, the geography of Sicily itself reinforced these dark possibilities. The island's rugged mountains and hidden valleys provided cover for secrets. Families could live at the edge of a village, unseen by most, their habits hidden behind stone walls and locked doors. In such isolation, strange behavior could easily be imagined or exaggerated into monstrosity. A family struggling with mental illness, genetic disorder, or extreme poverty might be recast in rumor as monstrous cannibals. The silence of the hills amplified the stories, and without records or proof, folklore easily became fact in the minds of those who told it. Thus, by 1914, the stage was set for a story like this to flourish. A land racked by poverty, haunted by famine, steeped in superstition, and burdened by the instability of a world at war. These were the conditions in which the tale of a family that ate its own could not only be believed but embraced as truth. It is here, in this world of hunger, isolation, and suspicion, that we must place the mysterious family at the center of this case. They did not exist in a vacuum. Their story was born from the soil of Sicily itself, a soil rich in beauty, but also rich in fear. At the heart of this story lies a family whose name has been blurred by time, whose identity exists more as a shadow than as a fact. In the records, if they exist at all, they appear only in fragments, an entry in a parish register, a line in a police log, a whisper in a villager's testimony. Yet, for those who lived in the hills of Sicily in 1914, they were not a nameless legend. They were neighbors, however distant. They were the people who lived on the edge of the village, half forgotten, half feared. And it was this very obscurity, this sense of strangeness, that helped shape the legend of the family that ate its own. Descriptions of the family vary, depending on the teller. Some accounts describe them as gaunt, hollow-eyed figures, their clothes ragged and their movements odd, as though they carried both hunger and madness within their bodies. Others insist they were simply poor peasants, indistinguishable from dozens of other struggling families, but cursed by an unlucky reputation. What unites these stories is the sense of distance. The family lived apart from the rest of the community, both physically and socially, separated by a farmhouse that sat just beyond the main cluster of homes. In small villages, such distance carried weight. To live away from the center was to live under suspicion, and suspicion, once ignited, rarely extinguished. The farmhouse itself was the subject of whispered tales. Children dared one another to approach its stone walls, swearing they could see strange figures moving behind the windows. Farmers claimed they avoided the path near the property, convinced that something unnatural lingered there. At night, neighbors said, faint sounds drifted across the fields, the wail of a child, the low murmur of chanting, the cries of animals, or perhaps of something worse. In reality, these could have been the ordinary noises of life, a baby fussing, a prayer muttered, a dog barking. But in a community primed for fear, ordinary sounds became sinister evidence. The family's lineage was also a subject of gossip. Many whispered that they had intermarried for generations, cousins marrying cousins, their bloodline closed to outsiders. In isolated communities, this was not uncommon. Transportation was limited, and marriages often happened within the village. But where others saw necessity, the community saw degeneration. Rumors of inbreeding carried a heavy stigma, and any physical or mental abnormalities among family members were quickly attributed to bad blood. Some claimed the children were sickly, pale, or prone to fits. Others said the men were unstable, quick to anger, or prone to wandering the fields at night. Such descriptions blurred fact and folklore, but together they created an image of a family marked by difference, outsiders even among their own people. The family's poverty was undeniable. Their clothing was patched and worn, their fields overgrown, their animals thin. In a land where appearance was a reflection of honor, their disheveled state branded them as failures. Pride mattered in Sicily, even in poverty. A family that could not keep its farm in order, that could not present itself with dignity at church, was viewed with both pity and suspicion. And pity, in communities where everyone struggled, often curdled quickly into contempt. To the villagers, the family was not simply poor, they were poor in a way that seemed shameful, unsettling, almost contagious. Some stories describe a mother at the center of the household, a woman who rarely spoke, her hair unkempt, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. Others focus on the patriarch, a man described as both domineering and absent, disappearing for days into the hills and returning with little explanation. Still others speak of the children, a brood of varying ages, rarely seen in the village square. The children's absence was itself enough to fuel speculation. In a culture where children played in the streets, their invisibility suggested secrecy. What were they hiding? Why did they not join the other families for festivals, for school, for church? Silence and absence spoke louder than words. Then there were the animals. Livestock was wealth in rural Sicily, but for this family, the animals were often described as poorly kept, malnourished, or mysteriously disappearing. Neighbors whispered of goats found slaughtered in unusual ways, their remains left half buried, as though rituals had been performed. Others spoke of chickens drained of blood, a detail that fueled rumors of dark practices. To outsiders, these might have been simple thefts or the work of wild animals. To those already suspicious, they were omens of something far worse. The most disturbing stories, however, came from those who claimed to have seen or heard things that suggested the family's appetite extended beyond the ordinary. A child from a neighboring farm told of peering through a window and seeing something he could not understand, shadows bent over what looked like a small body. A woman swore she heard cries that were not animal, but human, cut short by a sudden silence. A farmer insisted he saw the father carrying a bundle too heavy for its size, moving quickly into the house before anyone could stop him. These accounts, unverified and possibly embellished, became the foundation for the accusation that would haunt the family forever, that they had turned to eating their own bloodline. It is easy to imagine how such rumors spiraled. A family already marked by poverty, isolation, and strangeness became the perfect vessel for the community's darkest fears. In times of scarcity, it was easier to believe that the odd family on the edge of town was capable of monstrosity than to face the reality that hunger could make monsters of anyone. The family became both scapegoat and warning, proof that desperation could strip away humanity, and a tale to keep others within the boundaries of acceptable behavior. And yet, behind the layers of rumor, there is a chilling possibility that some truth existed. Hunger was real, isolation was real, and desperation could push people to unimaginable extremes. If even one act of cannibalism had occurred within the family, whether born of famine, madness, or ritual, it would have been enough to ignite the fire of legend. In a culture where memory was carried more by word than by writing, a single act could be magnified into generations of fear. Thus, the family at the center of this tale stands not as a clear set of individuals but as a composite of rumor, fear, and perhaps reality. They are described as both ordinary peasants and grotesque figures, both victims of poverty and perpetrators of horror. Their true identity may be lost to time, but their role in Sicilian folklore remains, the embodiment of what happens when isolation, poverty, and suspicion collide. As we move forward, the focus will shift to the first reports that brought their story into the open, the whispers that escaped their farmhouse and spread across the village, transforming one family's misfortune into one of the most disturbing legends in Sicilian history. The story of the family might have remained confined to hushed gossip and uneasy glances had it not been for a series of disturbing reports that emerged in 1914. These reports, whether grounded in fact or born entirely from suspicion, began to spread through the village like wildfire, turning private whispers into a public scandal. It was in these accounts that the legend of the family that ate its own first took form, shifting from quiet rumor to collective conviction. The earliest claim came from a local woman who swore she had seen something that chilled her to the bone. One evening, while returning from tending to her goats, she passed near the family's farmhouse and claimed to have heard cries that were unmistakably human, high-pitched, terrified, and abruptly silenced. The sound, she insisted, was not the cry of an animal. When she told her neighbors, they leaned closer, their eyes widening, their own suspicions feeding on her words. In a community already primed by fear, her testimony was enough to plant the seed. Something unspeakable was happening inside those walls. Soon after, another report surfaced, this time from a farmer whose fields bordered the family's land. He claimed to have seen smoke rising thick and black from the farmhouse chimney at unusual hours of the night. The smell, he said, was not that of burning wood or roasting meat but of something harsher, something that turned his stomach. Others began to echo his claim, swearing they too had noticed strange smoke or acrid scents carried on the night air. In reality, it could have been the burning of refuse, old bones, or spoiled food. But when filtered through the lens of suspicion, it became something far darker, evidence of flesh being consumed in secret. What truly fanned the flames of gossip, however, were the stories tied to missing children. In 1914, records of births and deaths were often incomplete, and it was not unusual for infants to die young, their passing marked only in parish books. Yet in this village, several infant deaths and disappearances began to converge around the same family. Some said the family's own children vanished mysteriously, never seen again after infancy. Others claimed that neighboring families lost babies under strange circumstances, illnesses that struck suddenly, infants that were here one day and gone the next. With little proof and even less medical understanding, grief-stricken families looked outward for explanations, and the isolated household on the hill became the perfect target. A particularly chilling account, recorded decades later in oral histories, described a midwife who had been summoned to the farmhouse. She claimed she arrived too late to save the newborn, but what she saw in the dim light filled her with horror. According to her testimony, the child's body was not treated with the reverent Sicilian families usually reserved for the dead. Instead, she claimed it was hidden away, and the family refused to allow her to prepare it for burial. She left the house shaken, whispering that she had seen something in the corner of the room, something wrapped in cloth that looked, to her, like butchered remains. Whether her imagination was heightened by exhaustion or by her own superstitions, the story spread quickly. It became proof in the eyes of the villagers that the rumors were true. The local priest, too, played a role in fueling the fire. In his sermons, he warned of sin, of families straying from the path of God, of those who engaged in acts against nature. Though he never named the family directly, everyone knew who he meant. In communities where religion guided every facet of life, the words of a priest carried enormous weight. His vague condemnations became confirmation, at least in the minds of his congregation, that something monstrous had taken place. Even livestock deaths became part of the narrative. Farmers reported goats and sheep vanishing, their bones later found near the family's property. Some insisted the remains were butchered in a way that did not resemble traditional slaughter, as though pieces had been taken and discarded. These claims may have been the result of theft, wild animals, or even exaggeration. But to villagers already convinced of the worst, it was further evidence that the family was not merely poor or strange, they were cannibals. What is striking about these reports is how they combined into a coherent narrative despite lacking solid evidence. A scream in the night, a strange smell, a missing child, a half-buried goat carcass, each detail on its own could be explained. Together, however, they formed a mosaic of horror that was impossible for the villagers to ignore. Fear thrives in patterns, and once the community began linking these events, the story wrote itself. Outside Sicily, similar cases show how rumors of cannibalism often grew in times of hardship. In Eastern Europe, during famines, families accused of hoarding food were often branded as flesh eaters. In rural France, stories circulated of families cursed by God for eating their own. These tales rarely carried official confirmation, but they served as moral lessons. When hunger and sin combined, humanity itself could be lost. In Sicily, the story of 1914 fit neatly into this tradition, becoming less about the family itself and more about the community's fear of moral collapse. Yet, the reports also carried an unsettling ambiguity. Were they deliberate fabrications, created to isolate a family that was already despised? Or were they genuine observations, distorted by fear into something darker? A scream could have been nothing more than a domestic dispute. Smoke could have come from burning spoiled meat or diseased livestock. Infant deaths could have been natural, tragic occurrences, as they often were in poor rural families. But in a culture where superstition colored every explanation, these ordinary tragedies became evidence of the unthinkable. The first reports of cannibalism, therefore, tell us as much about the community as they do about the family. They reveal how fragile the line was between reality and folklore, between tragedy and monstrosity. The villagers may have truly believed they were protecting themselves by speaking out, warning one another, and weaving a tale that turned their suspicions into certainty. In doing so, They ensured that the family would forever be remembered not as farmers or neighbors, but as monsters. And so, the legend took root. From that point forward, every rumor, every unexplained death, every cry in the night was traced back to the family on the hill. The story of the family that ate its own had escaped the walls of their farmhouse and embedded itself in the collective imagination of Sicily. Whether true or not, the family was now trapped in a prison far stronger than stone, the prison of a reputation built on fear. As the story grew, so too did attempts to explain it. Was it hunger? Was it madness? Or was it something embedded in their very blood? The answer, some would argue, lay not in the fields of Sicily but in the darker corridors of science, where heredity, illness, and degeneration might hold the key to understanding what truly happened behind those walls. As the legend of the family spread beyond their village, whispers of cannibalism began to merge with another powerful narrative of the early 20th century, the growing fascination and fear of heredity. Science was entering a new era, where the mysteries of bloodlines, genetic disorders, and inherited madness were beginning to attract both doctors and curious outsiders. In Sicily, this family became not just a moral warning but a supposed case study of degeneration. The villagers may have believed in curses, but academics and journalists who later encountered the story reframed it in the language of biology and medicine. What had once been called sin and monstrosity was now being explained as the product of corrupted blood. At the time, Sicily had a reputation in Italy and beyond as a place of superstition, poverty, and primitive customs. Scholars influenced by the pseudoscience of eugenics saw in isolated rural families the perfect subjects for their theories of inherited weakness. If a family was accused of cannibalism, these scholars argued, it was not simply a matter of hunger or choice. It was a matter of blood, a physical, hereditary taint that passed from one generation to the next. The more remote and impoverished the family, the more likely outsiders were to assume they carried some kind of biological flaw. One explanation that emerged in medical circles was linked to neurological disorders. Conditions such as Huntington's disease, which causes uncontrollable movements, mood swings, and cognitive decline, were already known in parts of Europe and were often mistaken for madness or possession. In Sicily, if a family displayed erratic behavior, sudden violence, or strange rituals, villagers might have read these symptoms as evidence of something inhuman. Later writers speculated that the accused family may have suffered from such a disorder, which in turn fed into their reputation for monstrosity. Another possibility often raised was porphyria, a genetic condition sometimes called the vampire's disease. It causes sensitivity to light, discolored teeth, and neurological issues that can include hallucinations or violent outbursts. While there is no direct evidence the family suffered from this, the very existence of such disorders gave credibility to the idea that physical ailments could give rise to terrifying folklore. Just as porphyria became linked to vampire legends in Eastern Europe, so too could neurological or metabolic disorders in Sicily become linked to stories of cannibalism. There was also the matter of inbreeding. Isolated families, particularly in rural Sicily, sometimes married within their own extended clans simply because of geographic and economic limitations. Over time, this could result in hereditary disorders becoming more pronounced. Outsiders who observed children born with deformities, or adults with visible disabilities, were quick to label these families as cursed. In the case of the cannibal family, their isolation, their poverty, and their refusal, or inability, to integrate with the larger community made them easy targets for such accusations. To the villagers, any unusual birth defect, mental illness, or sudden death in the family was not just unfortunate, it was proof of corrupted blood and sinful behavior. Science and folklore thus began to feed one another. Villagers spoke of curses, but visiting doctors spoke of degeneracy. Folklore painted the family as monsters, while early genetic theories rebranded them as specimens. Both approaches, however, dehumanized the family and stripped them of ordinary humanity. Whether cursed by God or condemned by biology, they were no longer simply people. They were examples, warnings, and subjects of study. This blending of folklore and pseudoscience was not unique to Sicily. Across Europe and America, poor and isolated families were often labeled in similar ways. In the Appalachian Mountains of the United States, stories circulated of inbred clans with strange behaviors and terrifying reputations. In France, rural families accused of witchcraft were sometimes later reinterpreted as suffering from hereditary insanity. In each case, the scientific explanations did not dispel the fear, they reinforced it. To say that a family was biologically cursed was, in some ways, even more terrifying than saying they were cursed by God, because it meant there was no escape. The case also highlights the tension between myth and medicine in that era. Newspapers and traveling writers loved stories that blurred the line between the grotesque and the scientific. When tales of the Sicilian family reached beyond the island, they were often dressed up with medical terminology to give them credibility. A writer might describe the family as suffering from atavistic tendencies, meaning a reversion to primitive behavior. Another might suggest they carried a hereditary compulsion toward flesh consumption. These phrases sounded clinical but were rooted more in imagination than evidence. The result was a story that could captivate both superstitious villagers and educated elites alike. What makes the story even more unsettling is how these explanations robbed the family of any chance at defense. If they were cursed, prayer would not save them. If they were genetically tainted, medicine of that time offered no cure. Their fate was sealed either way, and their reputation hardened into legend. Even if no act of cannibalism ever truly occurred, the combined weight of folklore and flawed science ensured that they would be remembered as monsters. The blending of science and folklore in this story also reflects a larger cultural anxiety about what it means to be human. Cannibalism is not just about hunger. It represents the ultimate breakdown of civilization and morality. To accuse a family of such an act was to place them outside the boundary of humanity itself. For villagers, the explanation was simple: they were cursed. For scientists, it was more complex: they were genetically predisposed to monstrosity. In both cases, however, the result was the same. The family became othered, a living cautionary tale. By the 1920s, these narratives had taken on a life of their own. The story of the family was no longer just a local rumor. It was being written into the larger body of European folklore, referenced in studies of degeneration, and whispered about in the same breath as werewolves, vampires, and other creatures of the night. The fact that real human beings stood at the center of this legend seemed to matter less and less. They were no longer remembered as individuals with names, lives, and struggles. They were remembered only as a symbol. In this way, science did not dispel the legend of the cannibal family. It gave it new fuel. By merging folklore with biology, the myth gained credibility in both village squares and academic halls. It became part horror story, part medical case study, part cultural cautionary tale. And this is where the story deepens, for once a family becomes a symbol, they are no longer judged by facts but by the fears and anxieties of the society that tells their story. The whispers about the family did not remain confined to the shadowy corners of their village. In communities plagued by poverty and fear, rumors are not simply idle talk, they become powerful tools of control and survival. By the time the family story reached its peak in 1914, it was no longer about whether they had actually eaten human flesh. It had become a full-blown moral panic, a witch hunt cloaked in modern anxieties but driven by the same primal impulses that had fueled persecutions for centuries. To understand how this panic spread, one must consider the fragile psychological state of Sicily at that time. Villages were tightly knit, bound together by the Catholic Church, by blood ties, and by a shared struggle against famine and political instability. Trust was essential, but so too was suspicion, because to survive, one had to know who might bring shame, dishonor, or even danger upon the community. A family marked as different, one accused of carrying a curse or engaging in unspeakable acts, threatened not only themselves but the fragile balance of the entire village. Their supposed monstrosity became a kind of scapegoat, a way for others to deflect their own fears and anxieties. This is the hallmark of a moral panic, the transformation of a few isolated accusations into a narrative of widespread danger. Villagers began to tell stories not only of cannibalism but of children disappearing in the night, livestock found mutilated, and strange figures seen wandering the hills at dusk. Each unexplained event, no matter how mundane, was folded into the legend. A missing goat wasn't the result of a thief or a predator, it was blamed on the cursed family. A child's sudden illness was not a matter of poor sanitation but a consequence of the family's evil aura. Thus the family's reputation fed on itself, growing larger with every retelling. Newspapers, already fascinated by sensational stories, only made matters worse. Small local presses, desperate to sell copies, printed lurid accounts of the monstrous Sicilian clan. Journalists embellished details, describing the family's home as a filthy den littered with bones, or portraying the family members as deformed, half-animal creatures. These descriptions were rarely based on first-hand observation. They were concocted to fit the expectations of readers who craved tales of horror. But once printed, these accounts were treated as fact. The line between folklore, rumor, and journalism dissolved, creating a feedback loop that pushed the family further into infamy. The role of the church cannot be ignored. Sicily in 1914 was steeped in Catholic tradition, and the church wielded immense influence over local life. Cannibalism was not simply a crime, it was the ultimate sin, an abomination against God's creation. Priests spoke of the family in sermons, warning that their existence was a sign of moral decay and divine punishment. Villagers were told that tolerating such people risked bringing God's wrath upon the entire community. Thus the panic was not just social or cultural, it was spiritual. To condemn the family was to protect the soul of the village itself. And so the stage was set for a witch hunt. Just as in earlier centuries, when women accused of witchcraft were subjected to public humiliation, torture, and execution, the family became the target of collective fear. They were isolated, shunned, and sometimes violently attacked. Children threw stones at them in the streets. Merchants refused to sell them food. Neighbors spit on the ground when they passed. Every gesture, every rumor, every insult served to strip them of their humanity. They were no longer members of the community. They were monsters living in its midst. The tragedy of witch hunts, however, is that they rarely require evidence. The more a family protested their innocence, the more guilty they appeared. If they denied eating human flesh, it was assumed they were lying to cover their shame. If they tried to remain hidden and silent, it was seen as proof they had something to conceal. In the logic of hysteria, every action or inaction confirmed the accusations. The family was caught in a trap with no exit. Violence soon followed. Accounts suggest that mobs occasionally gathered near the family's home, shouting curses, demanding they leave the village, or even attempting to set fire to their property. Though not every attempt succeeded, the threat was constant, leaving the family in a state of perpetual fear. Some stories claim that children of the family were dragged into the town square and mocked, their bodies examined for signs of corruption. Others suggest that the mother of the family was once forced to kneel in front of the church, enduring public scorn while the priest denounced her. Whether these specific stories are true or exaggerated, they reflect the real atmosphere of persecution that surrounded them. The witch hunt mentality was fueled by a deeper societal need, the need to draw boundaries between us and them. In times of instability, communities protect themselves by defining outsiders and branding them as dangerous. The family served this purpose perfectly. They were poor, isolated, and strange. They carried rumors of genetic illness, spiritual corruption, and monstrous appetites. By demonizing them, the villagers reinforced their own sense of purity and safety. The panic was not just about fear of cannibalism, it was about reinforcing the idea that the community itself was moral, righteous, and protected by God, while the family stood as the embodiment of everything corrupt and threatening. This process is disturbingly familiar in history. The witch hunts of Salem, the persecution of Jews in medieval Europe, the hysteria surrounding leper colonies, all followed the same pattern. A group is singled out, blamed for society's problems, stripped of humanity, and then punished in ways that reinforce the social order. The Sicilian family story fits neatly into this tradition. Their supposed cannibalism was less important than what it symbolized, the community's deepest fears about hunger, sin, and degeneration. By 1914, when these stories crystallized into legend, the family had been effectively erased as individuals. They were no longer remembered as people with names, with joys and sorrows, with daily struggles like everyone else. They had become symbols, shadows used to teach lessons and stoke fear. Whether they had truly eaten human flesh or not no longer mattered. The moral panic had taken on a life of its own, ensuring that their reputation would survive long after their bodies were gone. And this is the most haunting element of the witch hunt mentality. It does not end when the accused die. Their story lingers, passed from mouth to mouth, from newspaper to archive, from folklore to documentary. It becomes a permanent reminder of how quickly humanity can strip others of their humanity. In the Sicilian family's case, the panic sealed their fate not just in their lifetime but in history, branding them with a stigma they could never escape. To understand how the legend of the Sicilian cannibal family could have ever taken root, one must first confront the brutal reality of hunger in early 20th century Sicily. Poverty was not just a condition, it was a way of life etched into every corner of the island's landscape. Families struggled daily to survive, often living on bread, chestnuts, or whatever meager produce could be coaxed from rocky soil. The economy was fragile, dominated by landlords and overseers who exploited peasants through sharecropping systems that left entire villages in cycles of debt. In this world, famine was never far away. A failed harvest, a disease that struck livestock, or political turmoil disrupting trade could send entire communities spiraling into hunger within weeks. Against this backdrop, the accusation of cannibalism becomes both more horrific and more understandable. For villagers who themselves lived on the edge of starvation, the idea that a family might resort to eating human flesh was not beyond imagination. Hunger distorts morality, and though few would ever admit it, the fear of what one might do when faced with the slow death of famine haunted the collective psyche. Thus, the story of the family did not just frighten people, it mirrored their own hidden terrors. The island's geography only made matters worse. Many Sicilian villages were remote, tucked into mountains or perched along barren coastlines. Isolation meant limited access to markets and supplies. When famine struck, there was little relief to be found. Government aid was sporadic, and what little arrived was often siphoned off by corrupt officials before it reached those most in need. In such circumstances, whispers of desperate acts, of theft, of violence, of eating whatever could be found, spread quickly. A starving family living apart from the community became an easy target for the darkest suspicions. There are historical records from across Europe that echo this theme. During famines in France, Russia, and Ireland, accusations of cannibalism surfaced in villages where the line between survival and starvation had been crossed. Sometimes these accusations were exaggerated, born of hysteria. But sometimes they reflected grim realities. People had indeed been forced to consume the unthinkable. Sicily, with its entrenched poverty and cycles of famine, was not immune to such rumors. By 1914, when the legend of the cannibal family reached its height, the island had already endured multiple agricultural crises. Hunger was not an abstract threat, it was lived experience. But poverty did not only shape the possibility of desperate acts, it also shaped perception. Poor families in Sicily were often judged not by what they had done but by what others believed they were capable of doing. To the wealthier or more stable villagers, a family living in extreme deprivation looked dangerous, suspicious, even animalistic. Their ragged clothes, their emaciated faces, their isolation from the church and marketplace, all of these became visual symbols that fueled rumors of savagery. In a cruel irony, their suffering made them seem guilty. The scapegoating of the poor also served a social function. In times of collective hunger, communities often deflected blame onto the most vulnerable. If crops failed, it was easier to accuse a single family of wickedness than to confront the structural problems of land ownership, exploitation, and neglect. The cannibal family became a lightning rod, a way for villagers to channel their fear and despair outward rather than confront their own precarious situation. To condemn the family was, in a sense, to reaffirm one's own morality. We may be poor, but at least we are not like them. Yet beneath the cruelty of these accusations lies a disturbing truth about human desperation. History has shown that famine can strip away layers of culture and morality, revealing the raw struggle for survival beneath. In such times, communities fear not only what others might do, but what they themselves might be driven to do. The Sicilian legend resonated because it embodied this fear. By projecting the horror of cannibalism onto one family, the rest of the village could distance itself from the possibility lurking in every empty stomach. Poverty also left families vulnerable to exploitation by outsiders. Journalists, priests, and local authorities could point to the cannibal family as an example of degeneracy, proof of why Sicily lagged behind the modern world. Their suffering was weaponized, their reputation twisted into a cautionary tale. Rather than receiving aid or compassion, they were offered scorn and fear. The story of their supposed cannibalism reinforced the stereotypes that outsiders already held about Sicilians, that they were backward, superstitious, and prone to barbarism. In this way, the family's legend served not only local anxieties but broader cultural prejudices. The tragedy is that hunger itself was the invisible antagonist all along. The family, whether guilty of the accusations or not, lived in a time and place where survival was a daily battle. Their poverty made them vulnerable, their isolation made them targets, and the famine that haunted Sicily gave their legend the oxygen it needed to survive. Cannibalism was the ultimate taboo, but it was also the ultimate expression of desperation. Even the rumor of it was enough to terrify, because it forced everyone to confront the question, what would you do if faced with starvation? By the time the story solidified into folklore, the truth was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the lesson the legend seemed to teach, that poverty and hunger could reduce human beings to something less than human. The family became a symbol of the abyss that lay just beyond the edge of ordinary suffering, a warning whispered across dinner tables and in village squares. This is what happens when desperation takes hold. By the time the legend of the Sicilian cannibal family began to circulate beyond the village and seep into newspapers, academics and physicians of the early 20th century found themselves drawn to the tale. This was the age when science sought to classify, measure, and explain everything: criminal behavior, madness, deformity, even morality itself. The family story, shocking as it was, became a perfect case study for doctors, anthropologists, and journalists eager to analyze the boundary between myth and medical reality. The first wave of investigations came not from formal institutions but from local physicians and clergy, who saw in the rumors an opportunity to test their authority. Priests framed the family as evidence of moral decay, while doctors, influenced by the rising fields of psychiatry and criminology, began to suggest hereditary madness. They argued that cannibalism was not a sin alone but the result of degenerate blood. At the time, Cesare Lombroso's theories were widely read in Italy. Lombroso, the so-called father of criminology, claimed that criminals were biological throwbacks, atavistic beings who had failed to evolve fully, trapped between humanity and savagery. To scholars in his tradition, the cannibal family seemed to embody this theory. Their supposed behavior was cast not as choice but as proof that they belonged to an earlier, more primitive stage of evolution. Anthropologists, too, became fascinated. Sicily had long been treated as a kind of laboratory by outsiders, an island where ancient customs, banditry, and folklore could be studied as remnants of a more primitive Europe. The family became a specimen in this anthropological gaze. Writers speculated that their isolation and rumored inbreeding had preserved some ancient hunger, some genetic flaw that had surfaced in the form of cannibalism. Of course, these ideas had little scientific basis, but they reflected the prejudices of the era. Sicilians were often portrayed as racially inferior within Italy itself, and so the myth of a cannibal family dovetailed neatly with broader narratives of southern backwardness. One particularly persistent theory concerned epilepsy and other neurological disorders. In the early 1900s, epilepsy was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. Seizures, hallucinations, and sudden outbursts of violence were often seen as evidence of demonic possession or madness. If members of the family had suffered from such conditions, their behavior might have seemed inexplicable to neighbors. Doctors who later speculated about the case suggested that epilepsy, combined with malnutrition, could have produced violent compulsions or bizarre rituals that fed into the rumors of cannibalism. Another theory leaned on the rising awareness of prion-like diseases, though these would not be scientifically described until decades later. Some retroactive speculation has suggested that if the family truly practiced cannibalism, they could have contracted neurological conditions similar to kuru, a disorder documented among the 4 people of Papua New Guinea in the mid-20th century. Kuru, caused by the consumption of infected human brain tissue, leads to tremors, loss of coordination, and eventual madness. While it is impossible to know if such a disease ever existed in Sicily, the parallel remains chilling, for it suggests how myth and medicine sometimes overlap in disturbing ways. Psychiatric theories also abounded. Freud's ideas of unconscious drives and repressed instincts were just beginning to influence European thought. Some writers suggested that cannibalism represented a regression to infantile desires, a collapse of the barrier between civilization and primal hunger. Others framed it as a hysterical delusion, where the family had become trapped in their own mythology, believing themselves cursed and thus behaving as if they were monsters. In this reading, the cannibalism may never have occurred at all, but the family's psychological torment and the community's constant persecution drove them into behaviors that seemed to confirm the legend. What makes these scientific investigations so haunting is not their accuracy but their eagerness to turn human suffering into theory. Very little evidence was ever collected about the family itself. Few first-hand records remain, and most accounts were colored by bias, rumor, or sensationalism. Yet, doctors, criminologists, and anthropologists felt confident enough to weave elaborate explanations. They measured skulls, catalogued facial features, and compared the family's supposed habits to lists of criminal traits. These methods now read as grotesque pseudoscience, but at the time they carried the weight of authority. Once published in journals or newspapers, they transformed rumor into something that looked like fact. This interplay between science and sensationalism reflected a broader cultural obsession of the early 20th century, the fear of degeneration. Across Europe, intellectuals worried that modern civilization was being undermined by poverty, disease, and moral weakness. The cannibal family seemed to offer proof of these fears. They were portrayed as living evidence of what happens when society fails to protect itself, when bloodlines weaken, when hunger overwhelms morality, when people slip back into savagery. For reformers and moralists, their story was a warning. For scientists, it was a fascinating case study. For journalists, it was a sensational headline. In hindsight, the scientific theories say more about the anxieties of the investigators than about the family itself. Lombroso's criminology reflected fears of social disorder. Psychiatric interpretations reflected unease about the hidden darkness of the human mind. Genetic explanations reflected prejudices about poverty and southern Italy. In each case, the family became a mirror, reflecting back the worries of the society that judged them. Their humanity was stripped away, replaced by diagnoses, measurements, and sensational labels. And yet, buried within these flawed theories, there is a chilling possibility. Hunger, genetic illness, neurological disorder, or simple despair could indeed have produced behaviors that seemed monstrous to outsiders. Whether or not cannibalism ever occurred, the family's suffering was real. The scientific gaze may have been distorted, but it pointed toward deeper truths: the fragility of human morality under pressure, the power of inherited illness to shape lives, and the way isolation magnifies both poverty and suspicion. Thus, the scientific investigations of the time did not resolve the mystery, they deepened it. By attempting to explain the family, they turned them into something even more unsettling, not merely a local horror story, but a case that touched on the darkest corners of biology, psychology, and culture. The legend ceased to be just Sicilian. It became part of a wider European conversation about what it means to be human, and what happens when humanity begins to unravel. As the legend of the cannibal family reached its fever pitch, the weight of stigma became unbearable. In the eyes of their neighbors, they were no longer people but living symbols of corruption, poverty, and monstrosity. Whether the family truly committed acts of cannibalism or whether the rumors had been inflated beyond recognition no longer mattered. Their name, if it was ever known, was erased, replaced with whispers of the cursed ones or the eaters. What came next was both inevitable and tragic: their disappearance from the historical record. There are multiple versions of what happened to the family, each one shaped by the needs of the storyteller. Some accounts suggest that they were driven out of the village entirely, forced to abandon their home under the cover of night. According to this version, they wandered into the mountains, their fate uncertain, swallowed by the rugged Sicilian landscape. Others insist that they were victims of mob justice, attacked by villagers who could no longer bear their presence. These stories speak of torches and stones, of a house set ablaze, of screams in the night that mark the end of the cursed bloodline. No bodies were ever found, but the silence that followed was treated as confirmation of the villagers' victory. Another interpretation, less dramatic but no less haunting, is that the family simply disintegrated under the weight of their circumstances. Hunger, illness, and poverty may have claimed them one by one until there was no one left to carry the burden of their name. In a land where death was common and graves often unmarked, it would have been easy for an entire family to vanish without leaving a trace. And yet, because they had been so stigmatized, their disappearance was not treated with mourning but with relief. For the villagers, their absence was not a tragedy but a cleansing, a removal of a stain that had haunted the community. The silence that followed their disappearance was telling. No officials launched an investigation, no priests sought to redeem their souls, no neighbors recorded their fate. It was as if they had been erased deliberately, their humanity scrubbed from the record so that only the legend remained. This is the cruel irony of such stories. Those who are dehumanized in life are denied even the dignity of remembrance in death. But disappearance does not mean oblivion. While the family themselves faded, their story only grew stronger. Villagers continued to whisper warnings to children: "Do not stray near the woods, or the cursed family will take you." Travelers passing through were told of the monstrous clan that had once lived there, a way to explain both the poverty of the land and the moral lessons of survival. Over time, the story detached itself from the real people who had inspired it. The family became myth, their flesh and blood struggles transformed into a timeless parable about hunger, shame, and the dangers of isolation. This process of erasure and myth-making is not unique to Sicily. History is littered with families and individuals whose reputations became larger than life, overshadowing their reality. The werewolf trials of medieval France, the witch burnings of Germany, the degenerate clans documented by eugenicists in Appalachia, all followed the same arc. Real people, often poor and marginalized, were transformed into monsters. Once branded, their disappearance was not seen as loss but as confirmation of the legend. The Sicilian family thus joins a grim lineage of the forgotten, those whose humanity was sacrificed to feed the fears of the many. Others insisted that they had been real, pointing to isolated reports of police investigations, though no files have survived. The uncertainty only deepened the legend's power. The absence of proof became proof itself, an echo chamber where silence was taken as confirmation that something unspeakable had indeed occurred. The disappearance also raises uncomfortable questions about complicity. Did the villagers truly believe the family was guilty, or did they use the accusation as a way to rid themselves of a burden? Did local authorities look the other way because the family's removal suited their interests? Or did the myth grow so strong that people convinced themselves the family had never existed in human form, only as shadows, only as warnings? These questions may never be answered, but they underscore the chilling reality of moral panics. Once someone is branded as a monster, society often stops caring what happens to them. And so, the family's end remains unresolved, shrouded in ambiguity. They may have died violently, quietly, or anonymously, but in every version, they cease to exist as human beings. What lived on was not their flesh but their story, not their names but their curse. In this sense, their disappearance was both literal and symbolic. They were erased from the earth but immortalized in fear, remembered not for who they were but for what others believed them to be. This is the cruel fate of those consumed by legend. The real people are lost, but the shadows they cast remain forever. The Sicilian cannibal family disappeared from history, yet their absence became a presence, haunting, unsettling, and impossible to forget. The tale of the Sicilian cannibal family endures because it blurs the boundary between fact and folklore, history and horror. But when we peel away the layers of rumor, superstition, and oral tradition, what remains? Were they truly a family of flesh-eaters, or were they simply victims of a story too dark to die? To answer that question, we must sift through the evidence, or, more accurately, the lack of it, and confront the uncomfortable truth about how folklore often rewrites reality. Folklore thrives on exaggeration. Stories are not told to preserve accuracy but to carry meaning, to teach lessons, to inspire fear or wonder. In Sicily, where oral tradition has always been rich, stories of monsters, witches, and cursed bloodlines were told to explain the unexplainable. Famine could be personified as a family so desperate they ate their own. Shame could be transmuted into myth, where those who broke social codes were punished not just by neighbors but by eternity itself. The cannibal family, in this sense, was a metaphor for everything that could go wrong when hunger, poverty, and isolation combined. But as with all folklore, kernels of truth may lie beneath the embellishments. Researchers who have traced the origins of the legend suggest that it may have begun with a single disturbing incident, a case of grave robbing during a famine. Some accounts hint at bodies being dug up and consumed, not because of evil intent but because starvation leaves no room for morality. Others believe a child may have been found malnourished or disfigured in a way that led to whispers of inhumanity. From such incidents, stories can grow unchecked, morphing until they bear little resemblance to reality. What complicates matters is the role of early newspapers and traveling storytellers. By the early 20th century, tales of crime and depravity were sensationalized to sell copies and capture attention. A rumor whispered in a Sicilian village could be twisted into a lurid headline for an urban audience far removed from the reality of rural poverty. Reports of a degenerate family, mixed with tales of disease, hunger, and superstition, could have been amplified and distorted until the line between news and myth vanished. Once inked on paper, the legend had weight, even if the facts behind it had crumbled away. Skeptical historians argue that the family may never have existed at all, that the entire tale was an invention of fear. In this view, the story was a cultural warning, a kind of dark morality tale that told villagers what would happen if they allowed hunger or sin to overcome them. Much like the cautionary folktales of Europe, wolves lurking in the forest, witches preying on children, the cannibal family became a symbol rather than a memory. The specifics of names, dates, and places were less important than the atmosphere of dread it created. Yet dismissing the story entirely risks overlooking the social realities that may have birthed it. Sicily in the early 20th century was home to real families who suffered in silence, marginalized because of poverty, illness, or difference. Families marked by mental illness or genetic disease were often treated as outcasts, whispered about as cursed. Some were driven to remote areas, cut off from society, where rumors could thrive unchecked. In this sense, whether or not the cannibal family existed as described, families like them certainly did, stigmatized, abandoned, and remembered only through distorted tales. Another layer to this mystery lies in how folklore is weaponized. Stories of inbred or cannibalistic families were often used by those in power to reinforce divisions between respectable society and the poor. By framing the most impoverished as monstrous, the wealthy could avoid acknowledging their own responsibility in perpetuating hunger and suffering. The myth of the cannibal family thus served as a convenient scapegoat. Poverty was not a systemic failure but the natural outcome of degenerate bloodlines. It was easier to believe in monsters than to confront the cruelty of inequality. Over time, the folklore took on a life of its own. Villagers passed it down not as a story about poverty but as a supernatural warning. Parents told children not to stray too far at night, lest the cannibal family catch them. Travelers were warned of cursed valleys and abandoned houses where the family once lived. In the telling and retelling, the legend grew sharper, darker, more fantastical. Soon, reality no longer mattered. The family's truth was irrelevant. Their myth had become immortal. And this, perhaps, is the most unsettling aspect of the story, the way legends can consume real lives. If the family existed, their suffering was transformed into entertainment, their humanity stripped away in favor of a cautionary tale. If they never existed, the fact that people were willing to believe in them reveals how quickly societies can dehumanize the poor, the strange, and the different. In either case, the truth was lost, buried beneath layers of folklore that people preferred to believe. In separating folklore from reality, we find not clarity but reflection. The legend of the Sicilian cannibal family tells us less about the family itself and more about the fears of those who spread the story. Fear of hunger. Fear of difference. Fear of losing control in a world where survival was always uncertain. These fears needed a vessel, and so they were poured into the image of a cursed family, condemned to haunt history not as human beings but as shadows. The truth, then, is not whether the family ate human flesh. The truth is that stories of them reveal how human beings construct monsters out of desperation, how legends grow where evidence is scarce, and how folklore becomes more powerful than fact. Whether or not the cannibal family existed, the legend has survived for more than a century because it speaks to something deeper than evidence. It speaks to our darkest instincts, our oldest fears, and the thin line that separates civilization from chaos. In the decades since the legend of the Sicilian cannibal family first emerged, modern researchers, historians, folklorists, and even genetic scientists have attempted to untangle fact from fiction. What makes this case particularly fascinating is how it has evolved from a whispered folktale into an object of serious, if unsettling, investigation. Where villagers once invoked curses and priests warned of sin, modern investigators have turned to archives, psychology, anthropology, and even biology to ask the same haunting question. Was there ever truly a family that consumed its own? The first serious wave of modern interest came in the late 20th century, when folklorists began to document rural Sicilian stories that had been passed down for generations. Among these were persistent references to a cursed family that lived in isolation, ostracized for their supposed practices. Many of these accounts had strikingly similar details, references to a remote farmhouse, stories of strange disappearances, even hints that local authorities had once investigated but left no official records. To folklorists, this was gold, an oral tradition that had survived the erosion of time. But the more they searched for hard evidence, the more elusive it became. No birth records, no census entries, no death certificates tied definitively to such a family. The story existed everywhere and nowhere, a phantom in the historical record. Anthropologists approached the case differently. Rather than chasing evidence of cannibalism, they looked at the cultural conditions that might have produced the legend. Sicily in the early 1900s was a society under enormous stress, crippling poverty, widespread malnutrition, political unrest, and a rigid system of honor and shame. In such a world, entire families could become stigmatized for reasons that had little to do with reality. A child born with a deformity, a case of untreated mental illness, or even rumors of incest could be enough to brand a family as tainted. Once marked, they could be isolated, cut off from the community, and slowly transformed into monsters in the collective imagination. Still, some researchers have pressed further, asking whether science might shed light on what villagers described. Here, the conversation turns from folklore to genetics and psychology. One theory is that the family may have suffered from a rare genetic disorder, such as porphyria or a metabolic condition, that caused strange symptoms, skin discoloration, seizures, erratic behavior. Villagers unprepared to understand such conditions might have interpreted them as signs of corruption or monstrosity. Another possibility is severe malnutrition, which was rampant in rural Sicily at the time. Chronic hunger can lead to psychosis, aggressive behavior, and in the most desperate cases, cannibalism. To a starving family, such an act may not have been unthinkable. It may have been the only way to survive. There are also darker, more speculative avenues of inquiry. Psychologists studying intergenerational trauma have suggested that extreme isolation, combined with cycles of poverty and shame, can produce environments where taboos break down. If a family was shunned, denied resources, and treated as less than human, they might begin to live outside the moral boundaries of society. Cannibalism, in this framework, becomes not simply a survival tactic but an expression of a broken social contract, a descent into an existence where the only law is survival. Forensic science has also entered the discussion, though in a limited way. In the early 2000s, a small group of researchers attempted to locate burial sites rumored to be linked to the family. Excavations in remote parts of Sicily yielded bones, but none could be conclusively tied to cannibalism. Marks on bones, often interpreted as evidence of cutting or burning, could just as easily have been the result of burial practices or natural decomposition. Without DNA records, connecting these remains to a specific family was impossible. Yet even inconclusive findings fueled speculation. For every expert who argued that the evidence was too thin, there were others who pointed to the very absence of proof as suspicious, suggesting deliberate erasure or cover-up. This is where modern investigation collides with legend. In the absence of hard evidence, science cannot definitively prove or disprove the story, but it can illuminate the conditions that made it plausible. We know, for instance, that cannibalism is not unheard of in times of famine. From the Donner Party in America to the siege of Leningrad in World War II, history is replete with moments where starvation forced human beings to consume one another. Sicily's crushing poverty in 1914 created precisely the kind of environment where such horrors could occur. Whether it happened in this family or not, the possibility was real, and that possibility was enough to sustain the legend. What makes this case so compelling is not just the horror of the alleged acts, but the way it reflects back on society. The legend of the cannibal family forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how communities respond to suffering. Did the villagers project their own fears of hunger onto an already marginalized family? Did they allow the story to grow because it made their own survival seem more secure, their own suffering more bearable? In this sense, the legend becomes a mirror. It tells us less about the family themselves and more about the people who remembered them. Modern science has not solved the mystery, but it has reframed it. Rather than asking, did they eat human flesh? Researchers now ask, why did people believe they did? This shift is crucial, because it moves the conversation from sensationalism to understanding. It reminds us that legends are not static. They evolve, shaped by the needs and fears of the societies that tell them. The Sicilian cannibal family may have been real, or they may have been a phantom born of hunger and shame. But in either case, the legend reveals a deeper truth about human beings. When faced with desperation, we create monsters, sometimes out of others, sometimes out of ourselves. And so, the story persists. Each new investigation, whether folkloric, scientific, or forensic, adds another layer of speculation but never closure. The truth remains tantalizingly out of reach, a shadow that science cannot quite banish. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the legend survives not because it is factual but because it is necessary. Necessary to remind us of the thin line between civilization and chaos, between human and monster, between folklore and reality.